It started with a question so quiet that most people wouldn't have heard it even if they were listening. The kind of question that disappears into the noise of a crowded room and dies there unnoticed. Except this time it didn't, because the wrong man heard it. Or maybe the right one. And because of that, a secret that had been hiding in plain sight for years would begin to unravel in ways no one in that diner could have imagined. The man asking was 70 years old, maybe a little more, his age hard to pin down because hardship has a way of stealing years without asking permission, and he moved with a limp that made every step look like a negotiation with pain. It was just afternoon in a roadside diner off a state highway, the kind of place that smelled like coffee that had been on the burner too long and fried food that never quite left the air, every booth full, every counter seat taken, voices overlapping in that dull, steady hum of people eating and not really seeing one another. The old man had already been turned away 3 times. A retired couple by the window smiled at him and said they were saving the seat. A group of workers near the jukebox barely looked up. A young mother shifted her children closer and shook her head before he even finished asking. Each rejection was polite, practiced, the kind that lets people feel decent while doing nothing at all. By the time he reached the last open table, his shoulders had slumped just a little more, his hand trembling as it rested on the back of a chair that wasn't his to take. The man sitting there wore a leather vest faded by years of sun and road, heavy boots planted firmly on the floor, a cup of coffee cooling untouched in front of him. He didn't look friendly. He didn't look safe. He looked like someone most people avoided on instinct. The old man cleared his throat and asked, barely above a whisper, "Can I sit with you?" The leather-vested man didn't smile. He didn't glance around to see who might be watching. He stood up, pulled the chair out, and said one word, "Sit." In the 60 seconds that followed, he noticed things most people missed because most people weren't looking. The way the old man flinched when a plate clattered nearby, like his nerves were stretched too tight. The way his eyes kept drifting to the door, measuring time, counting something only he understood. The faint yellow bruise around his wrist, deliberate and circular, not the kind you get from a fall. The way he handled his food when it arrived, ordering only toast and coffee, staring at it for a moment like he wasn't sure he was allowed to eat, then taking small, careful bites as if he'd learned not to ask for more. His name, he eventually said, was Arthur Hale, and he spoke in short sentences, cautious ones, like every word had to pass an internal test before being released. He said the weather had been strange lately. He asked how long the diner had been there. He commented on how things used to be different, how people used to talk more. The leather-vested man didn't interrupt. He'd learned long ago that silence made room for truth, and he watched instead. He watched Arthur's hands shake when he lifted the cup. He watched how the limp worsened when Arthur shifted in his seat, favoring one side. He watched how Arthur kept touching the inside pocket of his jacket, checking for something, reassuring himself it was still there. There were other details too, small but telling. Shoes worn unevenly, like he'd been walking longer than he should. Hair cut unevenly, clean but careless, as if someone had done it quickly without asking how he liked it. A coat buttoned all the way up despite the warmth of the room. People came and went, plates were cleared, checks were paid, and still Arthur kept glancing at the door, the clock on the wall, the windows facing the parking lot. Finally, almost like he was testing the ground, Arthur said, "I'm not supposed to be out." The man across from him set his cup down. "Says who?" Arthur looked at the table. "My grandson. He says it's not safe, that I might get confused." There was a pause, long enough to feel heavy. "Do you get confused?" Arthur looked up then, met his eyes, and in that look was clarity, fear, and something close to desperation. "No," he said, and nothing more. Outside, a truck backfired, and Arthur flinched hard enough that his chair scraped the floor. He apologized for it, quickly, automatically, like someone used to apologizing for existing. He said he only had a little time. He said his grandson had an appointment and would be back soon. He said he'd caught a ride into town with someone who thought he was just visiting, someone who didn't ask questions. When he stood to leave, fumbling with his jacket, a small metal key slipped from his pocket and hit the floor. The leather-vested man picked it up, intending to hand it back, but Arthur had already turned away, limping faster than seemed possible, fear pushing him out the door and into the daylight. The key was warm from his hand. The tag read, Unit 18, Ridgeway Storage. The man turned it over slowly between his fingers, something in his chest tightening, because he'd seen this before. Not this exact shape, not this exact face, but the pattern, the quiet narrowing of a life, the way harm hid behind words like family and care and responsibility. Around them, the diner went on as if nothing had happened. People laughed. Someone complained about the coffee. The waitress wiped down the table Arthur had just left, never knowing she was erasing the outline of a moment that mattered. And somewhere not far away, a clock was ticking down the hours Arthur had left before someone noticed he was gone and decided what would happen next. By the time the diner door swung shut behind Arthur Hale, the question he'd asked was already echoing louder than the clatter of dishes and the low murmur of conversation, because the man he'd left behind had started doing something most people never did in situations like this. He was counting inconsistencies. He sat there long after his coffee went cold, replaying every movement, every hesitation, every glance toward the door, and the picture forming in his mind didn't look like confusion or age or harmless worry. It looked like containment. Arthur hadn't wandered in by accident. He timed it. He hadn't eaten like a man enjoying a meal. He'd eaten like someone who had learned that food could be limited, withheld, controlled. And people who were genuinely confused didn't speak with the sharp clarity Arthur had when he said no. They didn't protect something in their pocket with that kind of urgency, and they didn't apologize for flinching like they expected punishment to follow. The leather-vested man paid his check, nodded once to the waitress, and walked out into the parking lot where the heat shimmered above the asphalt, the small storage key still heavy in his palm. He didn't follow Arthur, not because he didn't care, but because he knew better than to spook someone already living on borrowed time. Instead, he went where he always went when something didn't sit right, a low, nondescript building a few miles outside town where men gathered who had learned, sometimes the hard way, what happened when no one paid attention. He told the story once, straight through, no embellishment, no drama, just the facts as he'd seen them, and when he finished, there was a silence that wasn't doubt but recognition. They'd all seen versions of this before. People didn't vanish loudly. They disappeared quietly, wrapped in explanations everyone wanted to believe. The storage unit came first. It was easy enough to check without drawing notice, and when the door rolled up, the air inside smelled like dust and old paper, the scent of things that had been hidden rather than forgotten. Boxes lined the walls, neatly labeled in careful handwriting that grew shakier toward the bottom of each letter. Inside them were documents Arthur should have had in his own home. Bank statements he clearly hadn't seen, insurance papers with beneficiaries changed and dates circled, medical records noting missed appointments that told a story of neglect rather than decline. There was a notebook too, thin and worn, filled with observations written late at night, fears cataloged in short lines, and on the first page, underlined twice, a sentence that made everything else fall into place. If something happens to me, this is why. Over the next few days, the pieces stacked up faster than they should have. A neighbor remembered seeing Arthur less and less, always waved off with a smile and an explanation about his health. A church volunteer recalled asking why Arthur hadn't been coming anymore and being told it was better for him to rest. A bank teller, uneasy in hindsight, admitted she'd processed withdrawals and transfers that didn't feel right but hadn't known how to question them. And at the center of it all was Arthur's grandson, Elliot, a man with a clean record, a steady job, and the kind of polite, measured tone that made people relax. He talked about responsibility, about sacrifice, about how hard it was to care for an aging relative. And people nodded, relieved to have a simple story that didn't require them to look closer. What they didn't see was the room Arthur slept in, the lock on the outside of the door, the heater that barely worked, the meals that had grown smaller over time. They didn't hear the way Elliot had started planting ideas early, mentioning confusion that hadn't been there, wandering that never happened, setting the stage so that when Arthur eventually disappeared, it would sound less like a crime and more like an inevitability. Pressure, when applied correctly, doesn't need to be loud, and it began to work on Elliot before he understood what was happening. Familiar faces appeared in public places, never close enough to threaten, always close enough to be noticed. He started talking too much, offering explanations no one had asked for, correcting imagined accusations, building a narrative faster than events required. That was when the waitress from the diner spoke up, her voice shaking as she admitted she'd seen Arthur before, slipping in during brief windows of time, always alone, always afraid, once whispering, almost as an afterthought, that if he didn't come back, it wasn't because he didn't want to. She'd carried that sentence with her for months, telling herself she was reading too much into it, that it wasn't her place, until she realized someone else had been paying attention too. When authorities were finally brought in, the story Elliot had rehearsed began to collapse under the weight of evidence he hadn't anticipated anyone finding. Digital searches about exposure and malnutrition, emails about policy payouts and timelines, a draft document labeled arrangements, dated weeks into the future. It wasn't neglect born of exhaustion, it was planning born of greed. Arthur, sitting in a quiet room miles away from the shed he'd been locked inside, answered questions without raising his voice, without anger, just stating facts as calmly as if he were describing the weather. He didn't cry when he spoke about the cold, or the hunger, or the silence. He cried once, briefly, when he admitted he'd been afraid no one would believe him. Because the worst part of being controlled wasn't the lock or the hunger, it was the slow erosion of credibility, the way isolation makes even truth sound like madness. And as the investigation moved forward, it became clear that the danger Arthur had escaped that day in the diner wasn't hypothetical or distant. It was immediate. If he'd stayed quiet, if he'd waited, if he'd decided not to ask a stranger for a place to sit, the story being prepared for him would have reached its ending, tidy and unquestioned, wrapped in sympathy for a devoted grandson and vague sadness for an old man who had simply faded away. The ending, when it finally came, wasn't loud or cinematic, and that was fitting, because what had almost happened to Arthur Hale had never been loud to begin with. It had crept forward in small, deniable steps, each one easy to explain away until the distance between care and cruelty had disappeared entirely. Elliot was arrested on a quiet morning, handcuffs clicking softly in the driveway where neighbors stood watching in confused silence, some of them still trying to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the charges being read aloud. Financial exploitation, elder abuse, unlawful confinement. Investigators laid it out piece by piece, showing how Arthur's money had been redirected, how his access to the outside world had been systematically cut off, how the living conditions in that converted shed were designed not to protect but to weaken, to hasten an ending while maintaining plausible deniability. In court, Elliot tried to sound reasonable, overwhelmed, misunderstood, insisting he'd only been doing his best, but love doesn't lock doors from the outside, and care doesn't ration food or heat. And when the evidence of planning surfaced, search histories, rewritten policies, conversations about cremation timelines, the story he'd built collapsed under its own weight. Arthur sat in the back of the courtroom on the day the verdict was read, flanked by people who had chosen to stay present rather than look away. And when the word guilty was spoken, he didn't smile or cry. He simply nodded, as if the truth had finally caught up to what he'd known all along. The weeks that followed were quieter in a different way. Arthur moved into a place where the doors opened from the inside, where meals were regular and warm, where a phone sat by his bed and rang because people wanted to hear his voice. The limp remained, but the tension around it eased, the constant fear draining away until his movements belonged to him again. He returned to the diner on a Tuesday not long after, the same one where everything had started, and this time, he didn't have to ask. The chair was already pulled out. He sat, drank his coffee, finished his toast, and for the first time in a long while, he wasn't watching the door. When he asked why someone had bothered to listen, why a single question had mattered, the answer was simple and unpolished. Because sometimes it is. Because you asked, and someone said yes. And that was the part people missed when they talked about the case later, focusing on the charges and the outcome and the obvious villain, because the real turning point had been smaller than that, quieter, a moment in a crowded diner when a man most people avoided chose not to, and in doing so proved that the difference between a life disappearing and a life continuing can be nothing more than the decision to see someone as a person and give them a place to sit.